Okay, we're live.
We're live. Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Yes, here we are again. We're with Team GIDYVR. We're holding our third online panel of 2020. As always, we miss your beautiful faces. We cannot wait to get back to doing real events, breathing together in the same room, maybe even hugging one another. Tonight we're going to talk about Bill C-6, which is also known as a conversion therapy bill. The bill has passed 2 readings in the House of Commons, and so far it's seen nearly overwhelming support. As is the case when any piece of gender identity legislation is introduced, there are conflicts with women's rights, children's rights, and charter rights. And the progressive line is kind of to ignore the conflicts and falsely accuse some critics of bigotry. Who wouldn't support a ban on conversion therapy? Bigots, right? Unfortunately, this bill conflates homosexuality and gender identity, combining a ban on the harmful practice of attempting to make gay people straight with beneficial practices such as watchful waiting and other types of mental health support for young children who are questioning their gender identity. We are going to hear from 3 experts about the ignored repercussions of Bill C-6. After the panelists speak, Holly and I are going to moderate a question and answer period. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the live chat throughout the event, and we'll be watching them. All right, so let me introduce our speakers. Megan Murphy is a writer, journalist, podcast host, and a well-known Canadian feminist. She was one of the brave few to speak out against Canada's Bill C-16 back in 2017. She's spoken internationally about gender identity, free speech, and women's rights. We also have Dr. Susan Bradley. Dr. Bradley is a professor emerita at the University of Toronto. She founded the Gender Identity Clinic for Children and Adolescents at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry in 1975. From 1989 to 99, she was the psychiatrist-in-chief at the Hospital for Sick Children and the head division of child psychiatry at U of T. She's also the co-author of more than 50 articles on various forms of psychopathology, including gender identity disorders, in children and adolescents. And then finally, we have Lisa Bildy. Lisa graduated from Western Law School in 1993, and she was called to the Ontario Bar in 1995. She practiced for a number of years in family and personal injury law. Lisa believes that the protection of individual rights and freedoms is essential to humans' flourishing. She's worked with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom since 2019. And recently, she contributed to a report to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights entitled Unconscionable and Unconstitutional, Bill C-6's attempt to dictate choices concerning sexuality and gender. All right, so why don't we get started? I think Megan is going to speak first. Go ahead, Megan.
Okay. I am removing the rest of you temporarily. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is like a super important issue that I think probably very few Canadians know about. I suspect most people haven't heard of Bill C-6, and as seems to be common practice nowadays, especially with these gender identity bills, this gender identity legislation, our politicians are pushing them through without really talking to anyone about it. And without engaging in public debate and, using what I consider to be pretty manipulative language. So Bill C-6 purports to address what actually is a serious issue, conversion therapy, which is a practice that really has been the cause of pain, strife, harm, and stigmatization for gay and lesbian people. And if this bill were simply about ensuring that homosexual people were not subjected to conversion therapy against their will, I might support it. But this is not the case. So the Canadian Psychological Association, the CPA, still defines conversion therapy as any formal therapeutic attempt to change the sexual orientation of bisexual, gay, and lesbian individuals to heterosexual. But many advocacy groups, professional organizations, and apparently the Canadian government, other governments as well, have taken it upon themselves to update this definition to add methods that aim to change the gender identity or gender expression of an individual. This, of course, has happened alongside activists and advocacy groups glomming on to the gay rights movement. So now we say LGBTQ. This highly successful marketing maneuver, so forcing trans into the gay rights movement, has meant that you can no longer do or say anything about gay or lesbian without also including and mentioning, usually centering, trans. This is all completely incoherent because gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing. But particularly in the context of conversion therapy, including gender identity in legislation against conversion therapy really gets it wrong. And no one really seems to be thinking this through at all, which makes me think that this is yet another piece of legislation based on political virtue signaling rather than an attempt to protect marginalized groups. Politicians, again, as they did with Bill C-16 back in 2017, are simply repeating mantras handed to them by activists. You know, love is love, celebrate diversity, born this way. And of course, activists will use propaganda and marketing strategies to sell their points. They come up with slogans to pressure for change. But it's really amazing how successful trans activism has been in terms of forcing organizations, politicians, the media, and institutions all around the world in a very, very short period of time to combine gender identity and sexual orientation unthinkingly and change policy and legislation on that basis. So activists alone should not be dictating law, policy, and medical practices, yet when it comes to trans, they are. There should be rigorous public debate as well as input from experts, especially when we're talking about something as serious as transitioning kids. While the CPA does not yet appear to have altered their definition of conversion therapy to include gender identity, in 2018, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, Board of Trustees updated their position to add that the APA recommends that ethical practitioners respect the identities of those with diverse gender expressions. This is a very troubling position for a professional organization of psychiatrists to take. This is an activist position, not an evidence-based one. And activism, again, should not dictate science, medicine, or therapy. The APA states that conversion therapy is rooted in the false and outdated assumption that homosexuality and other forms of gender and sexual diversity are mental disorders that can be cured. But this is inaccurate, and it really lacks an understanding of what gender is. So while homosexuality is about an individual, who an individual is attracted to and chooses to partner with, gender is just a set of rules, behaviors, and superficial cues applied to people based on their biological sex. Gender refers to masculine or feminine stereotypes or gender roles. So, for example, it's presumed that men and boys are inherently authoritative, assertive, dominant, unemotional, aggressive, rational, and drawn to things like sports, trucks, and roughhousing, whereas girls and women are presumed to be inherently nurturing, passive, emotional, irrational, delicate, and drawn to things like high heels, makeup, the color pink, ballet, homemaking, uncomfortable underwear, and so on. These ideas are pushed on kids from a really early age. And feminists have long rejected the idea that males and females must fit within these sexist categories, and have encouraged children and adults to reject these kinds of stereotypes. In progressive Canada, we should all have accepted that people should be free to be themselves. Boys can play with dolls and girls can play with trucks. Women can be leaders and men can be emotional. Yet, the modern concept of gender identity has turned this all on its head. Gender identity says that if a person breaks out of stereotypical gender roles, they can no longer be the sex they are. Instead, they must be the opposite sex. This, to me, is reminiscent of biological determinism. So the notion that biological sex and gender stereotypes are rigid and hardwired. And in fact, gender identity ideology goes a step further, insisting that gender, so behaviors, clothing preference, toy preference, inclinations, skills, etc., actually determines one's sex. Under gender identity ideology, a boy who plays with dolls and likes dresses is not just a boy who plays with dolls and likes dresses, but is in fact literally a girl and needs cross-sex hormones and surgery to appear more like his true self. It's incredibly strange to insist that in order for a person to really be themselves, they require a lifetime of hormones, prescribed not for health or medical reasons, but for superficial ones, and, invasive cosmetic surgeries. In other words, all of the hard work feminists have done over the years to insist people be accepted as they are and not forced into sexist gender roles has now been undone by gender identity ideology. And more concerningly, kids are now being subjected to intrusive experimental medical practices and operations in order to accommodate what is truly a faith-based ideology. And I say faith-based because there's no evidence that a male can become a female or vice versa. A person can alter the appearance of their body parts or remove them, but a woman is not merely a collection of various body parts. She is a system, interconnected, and the way she develops is completely connected to the puberty process she goes through as a girl or teen. These processes exist for a reason. Our bodies need those hormones. Stopping a child from going through puberty does not ensure that they can become the opposite sex. It ensures that they won't develop properly as a human being. That surge of sex hormones is needed for brain and bone development, as well as, of course, in order to be able to reproduce and develop primary and secondary sex characteristics. We have completely dehumanized people under this ideology, acting like male and female have interchangeable parts, like Mr. and Mrs. Potato Heads, like you remove a breast and you add a penis. This isn't how humans work. This isn't how any animal works. And as much as we would like to imagine that we've evolved beyond nature and biology, we are still animals at the end of the day. I also say faith-based because gender identity ideology rests on the idea that it's possible to be born in the wrong body. It is not. No one has a wrong body. They simply have the body they're born with. So if a woman has small breasts and she wants large breasts, that doesn't make her body wrong. If a person has a physical disability, it also doesn't make their body wrong. People who feel 25 on the inside but are actually 80 are not really 25. They're 80, no matter what they feel or desire. A person cannot identify out of material reality. It is absolutely inappropriate, and I would argue harmful, to tell a child that their body could be wrong. That if a girl doesn't like her vagina, she must transition to be a boy, and that this will make her happier. It will not. There's no evidence to support this, despite what activists claim. A girl who is told by adults that it's possible to transition to become a boy and that this will comfort and fulfill her, will, it will actually destroy her body for life. It'll render her infertile and unable to experience sexual pleasure with no recourse. All because adults have imposed an ideology on children, and because doctors and therapists have been convinced that they must transition children who request it, lest they be accused of transphobia, lose their jobs or practice, and now possibly be sent to jail. Do we want therapists and medical practitioners to be able to do their jobs ethically? Or do we want them to be beholden to activists who tout a religion that says non-believers must be silenced, ostracized, destroyed, fired, and even killed? We, women and feminists, have been shouting from the rooftops, begging to be heard. We are very concerned about these laws and practices, and to date, our government has not listened. The very people meant to represent our interests, who we vote for, will not so much as hear our concerns, never mind take them seriously. We tried to speak out when Bill C-16 was being passed in 2017, and we were ignored by the media and by politicians. The whole world has now seen the consequences of gender identity legislation. Males are assaulting female inmates in prison. Women are being forced out of shelters unless they're willing to share rooms with strange men. And vexatious male predators are dragging female estheticians to court on account of their refusal to wax male genitals. We are banned from social media, and our events are shut down. We're dropped by our publishers, removed from our political parties, and fired from our jobs. We are not bigoted. We are concerned. We're now seeing more and more girls caught up in this trend, being put on puberty blockers and hormones that have irreversible impacts, despite what activists claim, and are being fast-tracked towards surgeries that are definitely not reversible. Give girls a chance. Puberty is hard. Being a girl is hard. It's not comfortable. It can be scary. But the solution is not to turn them into boys. The solution is not to cut off their breasts, give them hysterectomies, prescribe them testosterone, and tell them that this will somehow resolve their angst. The term conversion therapy in this context is pretty ironic. Many of the girls who attempt to transition to become men, then desist, turn out to be lesbians. The confusion and fear of being a lesbian in a world where homophobia still exists, combined with the trans trend, is converting young lesbians into heterosexual boys. If Bill C-6 is passed, no therapist or medical practitioner will feel safe to suggest a watchful waiting approach, waiting to see if a youth's feelings of gender dysphoria will persist. In 80% of cases, the feelings disappear with time. Or suggest a child or teen try to feel comfortable with the body they have before disfiguring them for life. Already, trans activism and gender identity ideology and legislation have had a chilling effect. In 2015, Dr. Ken Zucker was fired from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto, which he had run for more than 30 years, after trans activists accused him of conversion therapy. His approach was really simply one of watchful waiting. So rather than immediately starting children who think they have gender dysphoria on the transition process, he thought it would be better to first try to help children feel comfortable in their own bodies. And actually, if the dysphoria persisted, Zucker would support them in their path to transitioning. So even those who believe that transitioning youth can sometimes be of help, I do not believe that any minor can consent to such a process personally, those people are quelled. Is criminalizing these kinds of people really the best way forward? This is what this bill aims to do. Minors can't vote or buy cigarettes or alcohol. Does the government of Canada think they can consent to something that has a much more serious impact? Something that, again, remains experimental. Even advocates for transitioning youth admit that long-term impacts are not known because there's no long-term studies. Is this something that we know will change that child's future in monumental and possibly dangerous ways? Children are not equipped to decide that they no longer want their body parts or to reproduce or to enjoy sex as adults. This bill, if passed, will not only be a horrific stain on Canadian history when we look back in shame and horror as the legal cases from regretful transitioned people pile up, but it will result in thousands of lives ruined, not only those of therapists and medical practitioners, those involved in the institutions promoting and offering these transitions, but those of Canadian youth whose lives will be marked forever by this regressive, homophobic, sexist, dangerous practice. So we all need to speak out now before it's too late, and it will be too late by the end of November. This bill is currently working its way through the system, and it's already passed second reading in the House of Commons. That's all from me for now. I'm adding our moderators. Oh, no, I'm adding Susan back. We will hear from Susan Bradley next. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Megan, and thank you. I think you said it very well.
Okay, I'm taking myself out, so you have the screen now.
What I'd like to do is to provide some background information, certainly about how this all began from my perspective. I actually began and saw my first transgender patient in 1969 when I was just a resident. We've stayed in touch, and he's in his late 60s and recently had a phalloplasty, for which I acted as a reference. I say this as the trans activists have accused me of being transphobic. Sometimes we need to keep on saying that despite our concerns about what's happening with youth, most of the people who work in this area are not transphobic. The opening of the clinic in 1975 in Toronto was the first and largest in Canada, and more than 1,000 youth have passed through the doors in those 35 years. Dr. Ken Zucker, as Megan mentioned, took over in 1985 when I moved to Sick Kids. Ken, in my mind, is the most knowledgeable and published academic in the world in this area. What have we learned about GID in kids? We have follow-ups from our clinic, both with the boys and with the girls, and the desistance rate over the period into late teenage years is over 80% in both boys and girls. But there are similar findings from Green's original study, as well as other European studies. So this is not an anomaly. Our interventions, as Megan mentioned, were essentially watch and wait, including support for families in terms of not encouraging behaviors or cross-gender interests, and helping find interests that could allow the child to develop friendships. We were very concerned about kids becoming isolated because of their interests. In children and teens generally, we strove to understand their distress, some related to sexual abuse, some to a belief that females are vulnerable, and certainly issues around homoerotic feelings. Later, we began encouraging some of the adolescents who presented with intense desires to transition we would refer them to endocrinologists for consideration of puberty blockers. on the assumption that we could buy time for them to consider their decision. As we understood it at that time, this was a reversible procedure. Even at that time, however, we were concerned that we might be subtly encouraging them to proceed to medical transition. Most of the teens who started on puberty blockers did in fact continue. And our experience was confirmed by the Swedish study that found that almost all teens given puberty blockers did in fact go on to medical, that is non-reversible transition. There have been recent developments that are important to understand, and these come largely out of the term ROGID, which is recent onset gender dysphoria. Lisa Littman studied this group of teens and their parents. And in contrast to earlier findings from our clinics, where the sex ratio was about 4 males to 1 female, this affected largely adolescent girls, many with no prior history of gender dysphoria. A large proportion of these girls had been diagnosed as having autism spectrum disorder high functioning or having autism spectrum disorder traits. Most had experienced peer rejection in elementary school and were often socially immature on entering adolescence. Many had developed crushes on same-sex peers, an issue that is not often talked about, but is not uncommon in teenage girls generally. Most struggled with their own feelings and how to fit in with their peer group. Many felt that being lesbian would make them even more different than they already felt. Internet searches, which these kids regularly engaged in, connected them with trans sites that immediately welcomed them as trans, even though they were really just questioning who they were or their feelings. Advice from these sites included not trusting parents if they disagreed, creating their story to tell in gender clinics that they had always felt this way, and other advice about how to transition, even to very young teens. Stories abound about classes with 3 to 4 other peers who had also come out as trans. For those of you who are familiar with young teens, you'll know that they're very vulnerable to peer issues. But parents became very distressed about the cult-like situation, but received very little help generally from the gender clinics who prescribed puberty blockers and even cross-sex hormones, often without parents' knowledge or permission. There are many facets about individuals with ASD traits that make them quite vulnerable in this situation. They tend to think in polarized, that is, all or nothing ways. Their thinking can be very rigid, and once they feel they are right about an issue, it can be very difficult to dissuade them. They're easily emotionally dysregulated and experience more depression, anxiety, and suicidal thinking than do teens without these traits. They're also vulnerable to things like eating and body dysmorphic disorders. There's the old question about, is there biological evidence for gender dysphoria? And as Megan has already pointed out, there is none. Gender dysphoria is a problem in one's mind about acceptance of oneself and one's biological sex. There's no evidence for the commonly used phrase, I was born this way. However, we know that for individuals who feel this way for long periods of time, it may become very difficult for them to think differently, and it has always seemed logical to support their transition. And this was our practice in our clinic. What is important is that doing this when a person has capacity to understand the impact about taking hormones that will alter their capacity to have children, enjoy a normal sexual life, and make them vulnerable to other difficulties such as osteoporosis, metabolic changes, and cancer is very different than expecting a teen to understand these issues and be seen as making what we would call and require an informed consent. Megan's already talked to the issue of our society not expecting that teens at an early stage in their development should be allowed to smoke, drink, vote, and do all of these things. And yet we seem to accept as okay that they can consent to these irreversible procedures. The bill, if passed, will criminalize conversion therapy. This is a coercive form of therapy, not practiced to any great extent, but it has been conflated with an intervention such as I described above that seeks to support minors who clearly are troubled and need help to ensure that they have had all opportunities to understand themselves and whether transition is really the best route to their feeling better. We know now from the many detransitioners that unless we preserve the right to provide assistance to these young people, their lives may become needlessly complicated and their bodies changed irreversibly. It is important, if this bill passes, that the stated intention not to prevent access to teachers, doctors, and mental health professionals who can work supportively with these youth before they pursue irreversible interventions is enshrined in the bill. At the moment, it seems to be an afterthought. The affirmative approach dismisses this step as they believe that they must simply accept what the youth says, regardless of the capacity of most youth in their early teens to make such life-altering decisions. The trans activists regard those who do not accept the affirmative approach as transphobic in their drive to silence those who disagree. If they are successful in seeing this bill passed and continue to conflate supportive therapy with conversion therapy, and the government does so without clearly understanding what can happen, the future will remain difficult for these vulnerable youth and their families. I will end with the story of a patient, Georgie, not his real name, but a former patient. Georgie had a very difficult childhood and ended up in care of the Children's Aid. He was assessed at the GID clinic around 7 or 8 and diagnosed with a gender identity disorder. He was followed annually and persisted in his wish to transition into his teens. He attended a group for LGBT group run by lesbian social workers for support. One day when I ran into him at the same agency where I consulted, I remarked on how well he looked and how smartly he was dressed. He told me he was no longer trans. Although I was surprised and could not ask questions at that point, it was explained to me later that he and another gay youth in the group had fallen in love, and that Georgie realized that simply being loved and accepted for who he was what he needed, and coming out as gay had shown him that he did not need to transition. And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this. So I work with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and as freedoms. I might have cut out there, so I'll just say that again. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees certain fundamental rights and freedoms to Canadians, and so our organization works to make sure that laws don't violate the Charter. So we went through this new bill with that lens in mind, and we're very concerned. I mean, there's a number of ways that this bill is unconstitutional as far as we're concerned. So I'll just take you through a few of the highlights. What I want to do in my few minutes here is I want to talk about what does the bill say? What was the law going to encompass so that everybody knows what we're talking about? What does that mean for therapists? What does it mean for parents? What does it mean for children? And what does it mean for society? So that's a lot to cover in 20 minutes. I talk fast at the best of times, but I'm going to really race. So hopefully we catch it all. So the Bill C-6 is just a second here. is very, very broad, very expansive, and is actually probably outside of the scope of what should properly be criminal law. So it is, the criminal code is supposed to prohibit, the criminal code should prohibit force and coercion and abuse in regards to attempts to change somebody's sexual orientation. But it goes much further than that. It goes on to actually cause harm, in our opinion, to adults and adolescents and children. So it doesn't actually target just those abusive practices that one would normally associate with conversion therapy. It actually criminalizes legitimate medical, psychological, and even spiritual supports for people who struggle with their sexuality or their gender identity or both. So what we're focusing on tonight is the impact on gender identity. And so Bill C-6 removes the ability of health professionals and parents to determine the treatments that are in the best interests of children who are experiencing gender distress. Instead, it imposes an ideological, one-size-fits-all treatment of social, hormonal, and eventually surgical gender transition. This is an unreasonable interference with children's rights and parents' rights under the Section 7 of the Charter, which guarantees the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. And so what this bill does, it actually imposes prison terms of up to 2 or 5 years, depending on the section, for, in the case of children, any attempt to implement conversion therapy. So they don't actually define things like gender identity or cisgender. So laws are supposed to be clear if they're going to be enforceable. And particularly when we're talking about criminal law, if they're not clear, you have to know what rule you're supposed to be following, especially if there's going to be a criminal penalty associated with it. And this bill is very vague in that regard. Just go back. Okay, and it doesn't also serve a legitimate criminal purposes. If it just targeted coercive forms of treatment, then it would be within the scope of criminal law, but it goes well beyond that. And it also gets into really what should be considered healthcare, which is a provincial jurisdiction. So criminal law is a federal jurisdiction, so it's unconstitutional in that regard as well. Okay, so what does it mean for therapists? And I think that's a big concern for people who are in this business, whether they're patients, clients, or practitioners themselves. Bill C-6's prohibition on therapies to change an individual's gender identity other than to pursue gender transition essentially imposes a one-way, one-size-fits-all treatment for helping children and adolescents who are experiencing gender dysphoria or who have other social, neurological, or psychological reasons leading them to question their gender identity. So despite ongoing medical and scientific debate about the best treatment for kids with gender distress, Bill C-6 actually ties the hands of caring parents and doctors, psychologists, counselors, and other medical professionals. It permits services relating to the exploration of one's identity or development, which also is quite vague. I mean, if you don't know what it is, then you don't know whether you're going to be potentially going to jail for doing it or whether it's okay. And so this is another reason why this law is it's just a bad law. It's poorly drafted, and it just leaves all of these unanswered questions, which will inevitably cast a chill on anybody practicing in this area in terms of providing therapy or medical treatments, because they don't know what's allowed and what isn't. So if the therapy or counseling service, when we're talking about children here, is deemed to have the purpose of changing a person's gender identity, which might be in flux. We're told that gender can be fluid, and there may be multiple different genders, and there could be one day and one the next. And so now in this law, it suggests that it's somehow fixed, and that if you're changing it or trying to change it, then you are risking criminal prosecution. So So it does create a serious risk of basically funneling all children with gender dysphoria down this medicalized path, and the potential long-term health effects of such measures is largely unstudied. So, and the other concern is when the bill actually says, I'm going to pull out the actual wording of it because this is quite concerning too. The definition of conversion therapy means a practice, treatment, or service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual or gender identity to cisgender. So think about that. If you are trying to desist, as we all know stories of people who've gone through the process and are trying to go back to their natal gender, this only allows you to transition one way, only to another. Like you cannot go back to being cisgender by the reading of this. So any attempt to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity to cisgender, think about that. I think that it could be criminalized potentially to help somebody detransition with that language. So that's very concerning too. Okay. So Megan asked me the other night, can therapists be charged with counseling somebody with the watchful waiting approach? I think it is certainly possible that they could be charged under this very, very broad bill. And particularly if they're targeted by activists or a complaint is made by a disgruntled teen. So I think that will be a very big concern for anybody who's a therapist in this area. So when the service is provided to a minor and you're convicted of conversion therapy, the sentence is up to 5 years in prison. So there are a couple of exceptions, as I mentioned, and one allows treatments that relate to a person's gender transition, which appears to suggest that it applies if you're going to assist them to transition. But it doesn't seem to suggest that any services which encourage someone to remain comfortable in their own body would be okay. So that's a concern. And as I mentioned, services to assist someone in detransitioning might be caught up in the prohibition as well. It's not clear. And the other exception is for treatment relating to a person's exploration of their identity or its development. So I think that could be very tricky for a cautious therapist as well, as they navigate the line between exploration of, where does exploration end and a commitment to transition begin? If you're trying to figure out where you're breaking the law, whether you're just talking about identity or whether when that child has decided that they're committed to transitioning, you have to somehow know where that line is. And I think that will also end up casting a chill on any sort of therapy that might get into this fraught area. And I know it's already very, very hard for parents who are looking for a cautious therapist these days, if they've got a child with perhaps rapid onset gender dysphoria, to get some help. It's already tough to find somebody to help, and I think this will just make it worse. Whether people are actually charged or not, this is going to just, I think, make it very hard for anyone to comfortably practice in this area. Okay, so I think the government is overstepping its role in deciding medical treatment issues. That's not what the government is there for. It's not their proper sphere. Clinicians' judgment is being usurped by the government. You should be able, as a clinician, to decide what's in the best interest of your particular patient or client, and not be told by the government what that should be. I think this is going to put a chill on treatment and research. I think it'll be taboo to discuss it even more than it already is. So what does it mean for parents? The bill says that causing a person who is under the age of 18 to undergo conversion therapy could result in imprisonment for up to 5 years. So that kind of turns on the word practice. So remember, they're criminalizing, when it comes to kids, they're criminalizing any practice, service, or therapy designed to convert somebody. So what does practice entail? Well, that's not defined either. If you think about, what if every time your young teenage daughter demands to go on testosterone, and it's your practice as a parent to say, no, you need to wait until you're an adult to do that, in the hope that the teen outgrows it, or if they believe it's a socially induced fad. Is that a practice designed to change a person's gender identity to cisgender, even though it might be in the best interest of their teen? The bill doesn't make that clear. So parents might find themselves in a precarious situation with this very broad bill as well. And then that brings up the question of consent. And when we're talking about children, parents get to make decisions about young children. That is their right as parents. And unfortunately, the trend these days seems to want to pit children against their own parents and sort of undermine the parent-child relationship. That is happening more and more with things that are being taught in school. And you see some of these activists who get on boards with kids who are looking into gender identity issues and suggest that if your parents aren't supportive of this, you need to find a new family. We'll be your family. It's very disturbing, and all of this just further undermines the parents' role and responsibility in raising their kids. I mean, nobody values kids more than their own parents. That's just the fact. And parents about their kids, they want what's best for their kids. There are a tiny, tiny, tiny number of parents out there who are horrible, but the vast majority are good, loving parents, and they only want what's best for their kids, and they know their kids better than anybody. So their rights are being undermined by this legislation as well. And the Charter protects parental rights. Age of consent to make decisions, well, that's an area of the law that's in flux. And I think we just saw a case just in the last week or so where an injunction was granted on a temporary basis to prohibit or slow down the process of getting a mastectomy for a 17-year-old. So that's an interesting case to watch and follow and see where that goes. I would keep a close eye on that. But generally speaking, where a child is a mature minor, they get to make some decisions for themselves. But if you're talking about a 12-year-old who's exploring their gender and wants to get on puberty blockers, I mean, normally that would be an age where most parents would still have a say in what their kids can or can't do medically. And what this bill seems to suggest is if the child is expressing a desire to transition, that's the path that they're going to get on. So there are a lot of questions and serious questions about this bill and what it means for parental rights. What does it mean for kids? Well, I think this is kids under other legislation, and I think this is actually becoming kind of watered down, but it was always in family law and in child protection, the best interest of the child was really the fundamental concern. I see that getting watered down a little bit, but and certainly here, I mean, the best interest of the child, that's an individual child. That's not a group dynamic. That is what is best for this particular child sitting right before you. And therapists are well equipped to figure that out, and parents are well equipped to figure that out. The government is not. So what this does is it undermines the best interests of the child test, I believe. Frankly, I think as Megan may have said in her part, the real conversion therapy is going to be the funneling of probably gay kids through a path of surgical transition. This may be a conversion therapy even worse than what they're trying to protect through this bill. And what does it mean for society? Well, I think it's an attack on individualism, as I suggested. One size fits all. The best interests of the group rather than the best interests of the child or the individual. It's an attack on families and the traditional understanding that parents know best. If families are the fundamental building block of society, this is an attack on that foundation. Big state. This is an intrusion by the state, once again, into the intimate affairs of its citizens. It's the state endorsement and enforcement of what in some cases is a probable social contagion. If this bill passes, it means that trans activism has succeeded in shutting down the conversation on a topic that impacts our most precious treasure, our kids. It's about gaslighting and fundamental freedoms. That's it's an attack on truth. And I mean, it's just very concerning to me. I honestly can't believe we've come to this stage where people are not allowed to speak the truth anymore. If this bill passes, truth is banned. We all have to agree in every single case that every single child that ever expresses the very thing that they're being now taught in school, that having an identity that's worn like a label, rather than built up from hard work and struggles and developing of your own personal principles and values, and cultivating your personality, this identity that they wear, they get a special flag for, that that is kind of cool and in some cases socially acceptable to be a part of. I mean, this is now going to be treated as a scientific fact, and those kids will be put on an irreversible path to affirm that interest, however transient or superficial. Now, I know that there are kids who would benefit from a transition, and they should have that if that's what their parents and their loving parents and a competent, regulated therapist think is the best path for them. But that's not going to be every kid. And so again, we have to come back to looking at what's in the best interest of each child and not assume that they should all be on that same medicalized path. But we aren't allowed that sort of nuance with a bill like this. And it reminds me of something you can go and look up if you're not familiar with, but that's Lysenkoism. And back in Stalin's days, this was a deliberate distortion of scientific facts or theories for purposes that are political, religious, or socially desirable. So I think that's what we're seeing here, honestly. It forces a cognitive dissonance and a violation of people's fundamental freedoms of conscience and opinion. If you're able to criminalize a conversation between the therapist and patient on an issue of gender, if the government can somehow decide that this state of affairs is acceptable and desirable, it's not much of a step further to then say that kind of discussion is hate speech. So I really think this is a very dangerous path that we're on. On that sorry note, I will end it there.
Thanks, Lisa. Let me just add everyone back in.
We're back. Hey, thank you. That was great, you guys. I am going to be a little bit selfish. I have a question that I would like to ask. It's my own question first. And it's directed towards Susan. Susan, I'm wondering, could you maybe describe what conversion therapy for homosexual people would look like and why it's harmful versus what kind of a watchful waiting approach for gender questioning children might look like? Just kind of compare and contrast the two.
The notion of conversion therapy is something that arose in the US essentially about 50 years ago. And it was designed to force individuals to give up their sexual orientation. And it could be very aversive in terms of threats to them about what was going to happen to them and things like that. One of the things that I find myself saying, it's quite a long time ago that we all learned that you are not wise as parents to use physical discipline as a punishment. But this is the kind of example of something that was highly coercive in a very inappropriate way that was considered okay. It was partly a part of the religious discomfort around homosexuality that led to this. And some of the early forms of it were led by people within church groups and things like that. But there were a number of psychologists who engaged in this, and they would see people and do behavior mod, if you know what I mean. Like they would impose penalties or quotes punishments for that kind of behavior. It didn't work. That's the thing that's really important about it. apart from the fact that it was highly abusive and coercive, it's ineffective. So I don't oppose the idea of a ban on conversion therapy, but the way it's being framed, and both Megan and Lisa, I think, have pointed it out quite clearly, it's the conflation with other forms of quite legitimate therapy where, you know, the interest is in trying to understand where the individual is coming from, what they're feeling, why they may be feeling that. There was none of that. It was really focused on your sexual orientation and changing that to something that was heterosexual. I don't know whether that answers your question.
It does, thank you. I think it's, you're describing that conversion therapy is abusive versus, oh, you know, waitful watching is not abusive.
Yeah. Yeah, and nearly all therapists nowadays would not consider doing anything like that, and that's why all of the energy that's being put into passing this kind of bill is somewhat ironic, because it's not something that anybody I know does it. I know that when we first started with the Gender Identity Clinic, there were still people in the US who were practicing that. There may have been people in Canada who, in religious communities where there was such an antipathy to sexual orientation differences, that may have, you know, put pressure on their individuals, but it's not something that most legitimate therapists practice nowadays.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the next question. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's a great talk. I have a question from the chat. Maybe this would be for you, Lisa. Can you explain how or who added gender identity to a bill about conversion therapy?
I'm not sure if I know who. You know, there was, and maybe Susan would be better, or Megan. There was a report by somebody named Jack Turbin. I did some reading about this recently, just through Colette. Susan's nodding. Maybe you know, Susan, more about this. But I think there was just like this one study that was done that suggested that it was harmful to, you know, to provide therapy that wasn't affirming to teens, and you know, that was increasing their suicide rates and so on. But it was debunked. Actually, there was a nice article with Lisa Littman as one of the co-authors in Quillette just recently that debunked that Turbin piece. It wasn't just in Quillette. There was a scholarly paper as well, but it was sort of condensed into a Quillette article. So check that out if you want to know a bit more. That may have been the start of it. I don't know, but I'm sure that there's been a fair bit of activism behind the scenes as certain people who want to, you know, get this enforced managed to make some inroads. I'm surprised too at how widely this has spread. I mean, it's been there have been in every province, or I shouldn't say every, but many provinces have been bringing in bills along this line in terms of municipal bylaws have been passed recently prohibiting conversion therapy too. So it's become quite a popular thing now. To impose these bans across the country everywhere, and they all include gender identity.
You know, I can presume that a significant part of this is attributable to the fact that the trans activists have allied themselves very strongly within the LGBT community, and believe that by doing that, they can argue, and this is where the term conflation that I was using earlier, I think has led to people pulling these things together. And we've been trying to argue that these are not the same. We argued with the Turbin issue around that as well. So the trans activists, I think, are responsible for bringing these bills forward under the guise that they're bringing their case against legitimate therapists who don't agree with the affirmative approach into the same kettle of fish. That's my understanding.
Thank you. I think this is a really interesting question. I think it could go to any of the panelists. So are the kids who decide to transition made aware of the fact that they might not actually be accepted as the gender that they're wanting to transition to a large segment of society? And based on that, like, would we consider that, or should we consider that a part of informed consent?
Anybody else want to tackle that?
I mean, my understanding is that they're not, and I think that's like a really good point, which is that I think that what these kids are being convinced of by trans activists, you know, by everything that they're seeing online, like, you know, the other big reality of this trend is that these kids are getting all of this online. Like, they're getting it from like Tumblr and stuff like that. And you know, they're seeing girls transitioning and saying, oh, like, look how much happier I am now. Like, I look like this cool boy now. Like, all you have to do is take testosterone and you can be just like me. And I think it's really actually horrible that they're being sold this lie, because I think it would feel really kind of devastating if you went through all this horrible stuff. These surgeries are horrible. Like, you know, there's side effects for all the cross-sex hormones and stuff like that that are very serious. But this is like a lot of surgeries, and there's often complications. Like I said, like, this is all experimental. And there's women who've transitioned to be men or trans men who've talked publicly about how horrible it is, and about the complications and all the medical problems and health problems that they've had afterwards. Scott Nugent is one of those people. But, you know, you're told that you're literally going to be the opposite sex if you do all this, and it's not true. Like, you don't end up with a functioning penis. People don't buy that you're the opposite sex half the time, you know, especially with male to female transitions. You just you don't look like a woman. I mean, your body parts are different. Like, you can't change your bone structure. You can't change the way your hips move. There's all these cues that we don't even think about when we talk about transition, again, in terms of like, just take this part off and add this part on and ta-da. Like, it's just not how male and female bodies work. And so most people, I think, probably don't end up feeling successful in their transition, and they're just totally lied to, and they go through these horrible processes. They spend all this money, and then you just end up, you know, disfigured and not the opposite sex at all.
I think that's fairly accurate. I think that there are some people who can accept that it's not perfect. But a lot of them, I think, spend the rest of their lifetime trying to make it more perfect. So one of my colleagues who was in the adult gender clinic at CAMH talked about the fact that it was a series of operations and complications, and that in fact went on nearly all of their life with the intention that they were going to get more perfect as they went along. And I casually mentioned this notion of this former patient who's now 69, and after his wife died, he eventually decided he had to have a phalloplasty. And you know, the phalloplasties are so imperfect that it's an awful lot of surgery and complications for something that is pretty less than good. But if you look at my example, this persists even to a point at which people may no longer be very sexual. They're continuing to try to have a perfect body. And you see, part of this comes from, is the psychic issue one of feeling inadequate or imperfect in some kind of way that they, I believe, come to from their sense of being rejected by peers for such a long time. And so they're looking for something that's going to make them accepted, and they get very caught up in perfection. Kids in the autism spectrum tend to be perfectionistic. So you put these things all together, and it's not an easy row for these people to hoe. It's quite difficult.
I just wanted to follow that up with you, Susan. So historically, have children been made aware of that?
You know,
if you catch my drift.
It's very hard to make let's take a 14 or a 15-year-old who thinks that you are offering them a solution to their distress. So that's the sort of apple over here. And it's very hard when they see this shiny thing that's going to make them feel better for them to hear anything else. And so the notion that they can actually make an informed decision, in my mind, is ludicrous. It just does not make sense. And that's where parents of a lot of these kids know that they are incapable of understanding the long-term consequences of these things, have been just up in arms about it all. I don't think that the people who are currently actively involved in doing this understand enough about child development to really say, you know, we've got to spend a lot of time helping them understand. What if you end up with cancer? What if you end up, these are all things that most kids don't understand anyway, and they can't believe that it will ever happen to them. So, you know, it's a very hard thing to have this shiny thing out here that says you're going to feel better. And for parent or therapists as well, to get this notion that they'll no longer be suicidal if they get this. And that's false too. They have as much suicidal difficulty after they've transitioned as they did before. And that's part of their difficulty with regulation of their feelings. That's, you know, not just, you know, what's going on around the transition. So it's a very complicated situation, and developmentally, in my view, they shouldn't be put in this situation. This is where, when we talk about parents' rights, parents know better. They know their kids. And when you talk to a lot of these parents who are watching their kids go through this, they are in agony, realizing that, you know, this child is not capable of making that kind of decision. You know, half of them can't decide what they're going to eat for breakfast in the morning, let alone, you know, that they can make a decision like that. So.
Great. I have a question for Lisa. How can school boards override parental rights by withholding information on social transition at school? What, if any, is the basis in law for this kind of violation of parental rights?
Well, that's a good question, and one I'm not sure I can give a great answer on, because I haven't looked at what authority they have. I know, though, that before I joined the Justice Center, there actually was a case that some of my colleagues were involved in, a very significant case involving parental rights as against the schools that were keeping information from their kids. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, honestly. Sorry, this isn't one that I have worked on myself. I'd like to, maybe I can give you an answer in the comment section after, if you want to.
Sure, or maybe you could even just comment on kind of the seriousness of the fact that we now have school boards and educators kind of wanting to withhold information from parents.
Yeah, well, I mean, fundamentally, it's just, it feels wrong. I mean, they shouldn't be. The parents are the first decision makers in their kids' lives, and should be able to have access to information, and should be able to make decisions for their kids' well-being. And I honestly, I wish more parents understood that they have the power to step away from the school boards too, and educate their own kids if they are feeling so inclined. I think more and more the school boards are. And teachers are taking an approach that that undermines the parental relationship, that serves to indoctrinate kids more than educate them. And I don't think I'm overstating that, just from what I am starting to now see in terms of the case inquiries that we get. And I mean, you all know Pamela Buffoni, who I'm helping with her case against the Ottawa School Board because the teacher told her daughter that there's no such thing as girls. I mean, that is indoctrination, pure and simple. You don't tell kids stuff like that, and you don't have the right to tell kids stuff like that. So, yeah, I honestly, I think the parents need to start being a bit more aggressive about this, a bit more, take a stand. Stand up to your teachers, the school boards, the principals. They don't own your kids, and if you can't get any satisfaction, you may want to consult with a lawyer, and you may want to consider other options for education too.
Thank you.
Regarding the bill, do any of you know if the Canadian government consulted psychiatric or psychological associations, or even individuals, any of your colleagues, Dr. Bradley, about this bill that you know of?
I've sent a letter to the Canadian Academy trying to clarify whether they have taken any action whatsoever, and expressing my concern. I have not heard back. A lot of the professional associations are quite intimidated and trying to find the way to be politically correct, and it's really unfortunate. It means that they've sort of been shut up. And I see that as really unfortunate. But I don't know about the Canadian Academy at this point. I'm trying to find out.
Great. I have another question that's maybe more geared towards Susan. It's pretty interesting. Do you think that if we could create new DSM subtypes, so the DSM, maybe for people who aren't aware, is it's what psychiatrists and psychologists would use to diagnose persons with mental illnesses, and it lists criteria for reaching a diagnosis. So do you think that if we created new DSM subtypes for gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, that we would be able to avoid kind of taking the one fast track route to surgery or hormones?
That's not clear to me that would solve the problem, in that the interpretation that most psychiatrists do in using something like the DSM is that they may come down clearly on a diagnosis, but they often will deal with individuals who have some components of the diagnosis and are in some distress. Like that's the leeway that we have. If a person is suffering and they have enough criteria, you can give them a diagnostic code, but it doesn't really remove what's happening socially, which is that this has become, I mean, we've used words like cult, and I believe that in many ways it's more akin to a cult, that just as vulnerable individuals in the past have been caught up in cults. Some of them have psychiatric problems. They don't all have them, but they can, different people can be involved in cults for a variety of reasons. And that, to me, is part of what's making this thing as complicated as it is. The trans activists are highly aggressive, as those of you know who have been attacked by them. They really don't care what they say about you. I was in the midst of trying to get a book that my daughter and I had worked on published recently, and we ended up having to go and check what was on Wikipedia, and I found a whole bunch of stuff about something that they said I had done and stuff like that, which fortunately my daughter, who's better at this than I am, said, well, you can remove it if it's libelous. She wasn't supposed to do it, nor was I, but we went ahead and did it anyway. But you have no idea. And I've seen with other things, if you ever Google yourself and see what's going on, there's a lot of really unpleasant stuff that's out there. So there you are.
Thank you.
I have another one for you, Dr. Bradley. Somebody asked, have you changed your mind about puberty blockers? Would you still refer patients for this treatment, knowing in today's climate?
I think we've learned as a result of the studies now that are coming out that they are not simply buying time. They are a first step in a pathway. It's the first step on the escalator. And it would be very wrong-minded, in my view, to prescribe those. We wouldn't prescribe them. We would send them to an endocrinologist, but our referral to the endocrinologist was enough for the endocrinologist to go ahead and do it. I think, and I remember worrying about this when we were doing it, I would not now be as comfortable sending kids. We usually waited until they were 15 or 16. But even that is probably not sensible now. Looking at the literature, I would want to know that that person really knew what they were doing and what the impact of those things were going to be, and not just the casual, there are side effects from all medications, this could happen, da, 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 da. I would want somebody to spend a lot of time talking about, do you really understand what it means if you can't have children, or if your sexual function is no longer adequate? Like, these are things that kids can't, they just can't grasp at that age adequately. So I would no longer prescribe them.
Thank you.
Amy, I'm going to come back and answer that question a little bit better now, because I pulled up the case that the Justice Center had done back in 2017. This was a court application about a new bill that was passed in Alberta that was supposed to allow, there was a provision in it that prohibited principals and teachers from notifying parents about activities that kids were getting involved in at school. And it was mainly it was about, the Gay Straight Alliances, that kind of thing. And so it basically kept parents under the loop that their kids are being involved in that. And so the short answer to the question is in the summary here, and that is that it was prior to that bill, it was basically just an exception where schools could, on individual case-by-case basis, decide to withhold information if they felt that maybe the child's safety was in jeopardy or something. Then they might keep it from the parents, but not as a matter of course would you keep all parents out all the time about anything to do with this kind of thing. And so that ended up that the bill, when the government changed, the bill was, I don't know all the details because it's not even in Ontario where I am, but I don't think it ended up, I think they put in new legislation that didn't have that. In any event, I think that any time that the school is withholding information from you, that should be an alarm bell. And it would be the exception rather than the rule that they'd be allowed to do that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's interesting. It's it reminds me of when we see online when a lot of people will bring up the kind of tactics used by activists and say this is a method that people who are grooming children use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting, actually. I don't know if some of you saw this, but earlier on in the pandemic, when kids were just starting to learn from home and parents were starting to overhear what was being taught to their kids, I saw one exchange on Twitter where a teacher, it was in the States, but where he basically said, we can't be having our conversations now as freely in front of parents. They're like listening in, and they're, they might have a problem with what we're teaching the kids, right? And I mean, it was horrifying to think that these are your teachers. These are not the people who are supposed to be grooming your children. But it was grooming language that this teacher was using. It was really, really disturbing. So yeah.
Scary, very scary. I think our next question, maybe this would be a good one for Megan. We get similar questions anytime we do an event, and it's like either what can I do to help? In this case, it's how can we stop this bill from going through?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to stop this bill. I think it's so scary and dangerous. And we, like I said, we have a couple weeks, I think, third reading. We don't have a date yet, as far as I understand it, but I think third reading will be at the end of November. If you do want to submit a brief, I posted the link in the live chat, and after this is over, I'll post it in the comments down below as well, and I'll pin it. So we have been told that we have until the end of the month to submit a brief. You have to contact your MP, and send them an email, but my MP doesn't respond to my emails ever, so phone them and try to actually talk to somebody on the phone. Try to set up a meeting with them if you can. This is their job. Like, it's their job to listen to your concerns. And I'm always like amazed at how like they brazenly just ignore you. Like the amount of times that I've like called and emailed my MP and my MLAs and things, and just no response. I'm like, okay, I'm not voting for you anymore. But so do that. Write letters to the editor, write to media, and try to force them. I mean, the Canadian media is so bad on this stuff, so we sort of all know what to expect from them, which is nothing. But do write to them. I mean, the main thing is that the politicians and the media, the politicians have to know that we're paying attention and that we care, and that there's lots of us, because what they do is they pretend like it's a few crackpots. With anybody who is opposed to gender identity ideology or legislation is assumed to be or intentionally positioned as hateful, right? Or just like some right-wing religious bigot. And there's nothing wrong with right-wing people or religious people. These are just their words, and we know that these are words that they use to dismiss people and to brush them off as irrelevant to the discussion, because all progressive Canadians should support this thing, because otherwise it's akin to homophobia, and homophobia is bad. But it's not akin to homophobia. It's something completely different. And so we need to make ourselves heard. Meeting with an MP also means that you don't have to do anything publicly. Like if you feel afraid, unsafe in your job, you don't want to be ostracized by all of the cool kids in Vancouver. I mean, they're not that great anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But, if you talk to MPs, if enough people are talking to their MPs, then the MPs will start talking to each other, and they'll be like, oh, these people are contacting me about this thing. Does this actually matter? So those are all my suggestions. Oh, and yeah, I totally agree with Lisa. I feel so bad for parents in this climate. It would be so scary and horrifying. And I know parents of young kids who are going through this exact same thing, and they're starting on the SOGI thing in their schools. They start with this SOGI thing really young.
Kindergarten.
So, yeah. So teaching kids that, everybody has a gender identity, and who knows what a boy or a girl is. And if a boy is acting like a girl, then maybe he's actually a girl, and you should be paying attention to those clues to figure that out. It's just all sexist, messed up, irrational, dangerous stuff. But don't just be silent. Go meet with the teachers, go meet with the principal and say, I don't want my kid learning this. There's no evidence to support this. This is anti-science. This is sexism. And yeah, those are all my suggestions.
I was going to say, I always Megan and I have a mutual friend who reached out to us about this recently. And I reached out to my son's school about this. And one of the resources I always send to teachers or anyone that I think might listen is from the Transgender Trend website. Has so many great resources. You know, I don't know if they'll fall on deaf ears. I hope not. But I think it's a great resource for parents to get started, you know. So
I just have one more thing, and because I think I forgot to say this in my talk, but so the person who sponsored this bill is David Lametti. So I would try to contact him too. I mean, I don't know that he'll listen, because obviously if he's sponsoring the bill, he supports it for whatever reason, either because he thinks it'll make him look good, you know, it's progressive virtue signaling again, or maybe he doesn't understand the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, in which case, you know, we should explain to him that there is a big difference. Maybe he doesn't realize what the harms are, or maybe he thinks he can just push this through and nobody will notice or care. But that's not true. So yeah, he's the current Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. And you can send him an email. His email is on the, if you just Google him online, you'll find his email and phone number.
I would just add to that I think it's going to take a groundswell, honestly. A few voices are easy to ignore. A groundswell is harder to ignore. And I really encourage everyone to tell everyone. We're in a society right now that is just through the looking glass. It's just weird. You know, evidence is not something anybody bothers with anymore. Truth doesn't mean what it should. I mean, we really are in a strange post-truth world. And you could go and try and explain all of this to your MP, but if they're caught up on this bandwagon, they won't hear it. They won't hear the evidence. Facts don't matter. You know, people are possessed right now. A lot of people, I'm not saying all our MPs are, but, you know, a lot of people are possessed by an ideology right now. It's a bit scary. You know, that's why I say it's easy to dismiss a few people. If there are a lot of people speaking up loudly and doing their very best to explain the problem, and being persistent and brave about this, it'll help. You know, but it's going to take at least that for this to not get passed. I mean, it probably will get passed. So, you know, get out there and do something about it.
Yeah, sadly. And I would say, Lisa, we met because you wrote a very strongly worded letter to my NDP NP, Peter Julian, telling him that he needed to unblock me on Twitter. And he had blocked me because of comments about gender identity. And he actually did. So it was effective. And thank you for that. Part of the groundswell.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do one more question to end off. So let me see. Maybe we can go with another one kind of about the actual treatment that a lot of these youth are receiving. I don't think a lot of Canadians recognize how serious the surgical and medical treatments are. So someone commented that something that baffles them is about this ideology is the notion out there that these surgeries are seen as easy, or that surgical recovery can be easily lived with. We use kind of euphemisms rather than saying like double mastectomy, we say top surgery. So maybe you guys could just speak to that and speak to the seriousness of the treatment that very young, sometimes children, are undergoing.
Well, I'm sure that Susan is better equipped to speak about that, but let me just jump in real quick with one observation, and that is, you know, what is it that we're criminally banning versus what is it we're endorsing and pushing everyone towards? It's really shocking when you consider that what we are saying is a good thing is a path that leads to these drastic surgeries. Well, I was trying to understand what was meant by conversion therapy in the eyes of a trans person. And so I read an article, and I mean, this is just one article by one person, so maybe it's not indicative, but this was a person who had transitioned later in life after already having a couple of children and getting married. So when this person was a teenager and still a female, she, in her mind, she had, I guess she had a traumatic sexual experience and was also kicked out of her house. And so she went to see a counselor, I guess when she was in maybe some foster care or something like that, and explained this backstory, but also said that she felt that she was a boy and had always felt like she was a boy. And rather than immediately endorsing that, the therapist gave her some things to work through to deal with her sexual trauma that she had been through. And that is what she calls now conversion therapy. And I thought, okay, well, so we're criminalizing that, but we're endorsing removing your breasts.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Well, the issue is the harm that we're inflicting. And I have some hope that if more physicians could be, I hate to use the term sued, but around inflicting harm, that it may start to put the brakes on some of this, because these are harmful procedures, and they're harmful in that the justification for a long period of time, a lot of the endocrinologists and to some extent surgeons, but mostly the endocrinologists, were the people who were in the middle of beginning both the puberty blockers and then the cross-sex hormones. They were feeling that these kids were all going to go out and commit suicide if they didn't do something. That is something that has been disproven. When you look longer term at the level of suicide ideation and attempts in a population of individuals, even those who have transitioned, it is much higher than your ordinary or typical population. So we're not dramatically doing anything positive. They may in fact say they're feeling better, but when you talk to a lot of them aren't feeling any better. So the evidence for doing these irreversible kinds of procedures is quite slim. It depends on what population you're talking to. If you talk to detransitioners, I mean, you would be absolutely convinced that none of it should have ever happened. There are some individuals who will say, I'm better, I feel better. The patient that I quoted right at the top of this would say, I'm better. But I have followed this person for the better part of 50 years, and he is continuing to have difficulties that I think are just part and parcel of the way he operates. And I don't think the surgery has made any real difference. I think that the individual that he married had 2 children of her own, and he was a very good parent with these children. But I think he could have been a very good parent as another mother in that family. Like, I don't see that made the difference to this family. And so there are a lot of questions about the value of all these surgical procedures, and they're all accompanied by complications and things, that people have to continue to do in order, for example, when they build a vagina, they've got to keep on dilating to make that vagina work, and they get all sorts of contractures and things like that. So there are way too many things that aren't all that good. And I mean, I'm coming to it from the viewpoint that many of these people, if they could accept being gay or lesbian, would in fact probably do just as well psychologically as they have done with having gone through all that they've gone through. And gradually, I think some of the physicians who are beginning to be questioned about some of this stuff are starting to ask themselves, what is the evidence for us doing no harm? And that's where I think our chance of slowing this down is, because if they're sincere in asking themselves, are they doing no harm? They've got an awfully big question there to answer.
Absolutely. Thank you. Should we wrap up there?
Yeah, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much, Susan and Lisa. I learned a lot from you, and I'm really, really happy that we were able to get together on such short notice to do that. Thank you for participating. I know we didn't give you very much time. Things just suddenly felt very urgent. And thanks so much, Amy and Holly, for doing such a good job moderating and choosing such good questions, and for all your organizing work as always. And thank you so much to everyone who came. And I hope that you guys all take action.
Yes.
Thank you.
ASAP.
Talk to your MPs.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I found
Thank you,
Get on the
everyone.
phone.
very well done and very interesting. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
Bye.